Right. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Christian Draper, and I am going to share my screen to start off this presentation. The way that this evening will work is we will go through about an hour of a presentation, talk a little bit about user experience, the history of user experience design, and then you'll have some time to work on a project that I'll give you at the end of that hour. And then we have some teaching assistants and project managers who are going to help out with the rest of the course. In the evening, they'll have Slack open for Q&A, and then they will send out another Zoom link that will then allow you to have smaller group discussions and go over the assignment that we give you to be able to talk about it and learn from it and answer any questions you might have about it. Okay. Today we're talking about user experience design. Where does it come from? Where is it going? How do you fit into it? Every employer wants employees who can wear multiple hats. They want somebody with extraordinary skills. Large organizations can afford to hire specialists, but most companies tend to need people who can do more than one thing. User experience designers, more than any other fields, fall prey to companies who want them to do everything from research to visual design to code. Job ads will ask for user experience designers who can create visual brand style guide for online print, design mobile apps, be Photoshop or Sketch experts, and they write advertising and marketing copy as well, lead out with business strategy, perform ethnographic research, and at the same time code in JavaScript and HTML and CSS. It's usually not quite that bad, but there is definitely some high expectations for user experience designers. And not every company expects the same type of work from the user experience design team. We'll talk a little bit about how many of these areas in this introductory course fit into UX design, but just realize that there's a lot of work available for a designer who can truly understand and be conversant in more than one of these areas that we'll talk about. They refer to the people who can do everything as a unicorn, as in they're mythical. But I think that all of the skills in user experience design are learnable and that you can add more and more to your plate so that you can come to the table with more and be able to share more skills. And that's what this course is going to introduce to you, some of the skills that are part of the user experience design canon. Now, user experience design is also filled with an outside perspective, has immeasurable value. A lot of people join user experience design profession as a second career. They bring the insights from that other career with them, and it's usually helpful and helps them have empathy for a user. And if you find the material that we cover tonight in this course interesting and you really want to pursue this as a potential career path, you should really consider enrolling in our full-time course, which will launch hopefully October 1st. That's the aim that we have right now. That course will give you a very strong foundation in building a UX career and help you create value for a company right off the bat. So keep that in mind. So let's go back to where user experience design comes from. We started out with computers. You know, the earlier computers built in the 1940s are big as buildings, 1,800 square feet sometimes. It's as big as my house. Users tended to be researchers at large educational research institutions. The users of computers would be punching holes in cards in order to make them work. The interface was a physical tool that allowed the user to actually punch holes in real paper in order to move forward. Those things ended up advancing, but this was a computer interface in the early days of computing. Gradually, researchers were able to reduce computers in size, and It became smaller and began to be used in more business applications in the 1960s and 70s. And academic and enterprise research organizations continued to invent and refine technologies like the mouse that you see here, and also graphical screen interfaces throughout those early years of computing. IBM, Xerox, AT&T were all industry institutions that were contributing to the development of the important computing technologies that we sometimes take for granted today, like the graphical interface. Meanwhile, human computer researchers were taking on the impact of and use of computer interfaces and the process of technological development and new applications of technology. And that human computer interaction was known as HCI, and it emerged as a design discipline, or a science of design, if you will. Usability as a term emerged from the research done by these researchers and human factors specialists in industry throughout the 1970s and 1980s. Usability simply means how easily someone can use a given digital interface or device or product. As with most industries, usability has evolved, and design principles that increase interface usability have grown and been refined over time, naturally mapping along with the development of interfaces and the ubiquitousness of computers so that more people were using them. Usability engineering is something that became part of the lexicon as the design process evolved. Researchers like Jacob Nielsen and Donald Norman and Steve Krug began promoting the idea of usability specifications, where usability was quantified. That means you could count usability issues, and specifications provided a goal for iterative design cycles to try to achieve and measure progress along the way. They also advocated more participatory design, where users took a more active role in the design process. Ethnographic techniques were incorporated into the design process as well, bringing researchers and designers into the context where the interface would be used by the user, the situation, so that they could observe the user in their natural habitat, so to speak. And thus they would have a less biased environment in which to make design decisions. As users became involved in this design process, user-centered design became the de facto design paradigm for computer science, with universities rolling out user-centered design courses and in their computer science programs, and making that user-centered design a research focus for professors. While human-computer action, ACI as a field, is not entirely forgotten, its influence as a discipline has waned in the wake of the internet and the age of smartphones. HCI and human factors were the key terms used during the 80s and the 90s, but in 1993, a new term was coined by Don Norman that has caught hold and dominated the discussion of computer interface design outside of academia for most of the last 3 decades, and is used to describe the activity of interface designers in the digital age. That term is user experience design, or UX. So cognitive scientist Don Norman, as I mentioned, he coined the term user experience when naming his research group at Apple Computer Company in 1993. Norman had been hired to build a team to improve Apple products. And in 1998, Donald Norman had an interview with Peter Merholtz, who was of the design agency Adaptive Path, and he said that he thought the term had begun to lose its value. He said, "I invented the term because I thought human interface and usability were too narrow. I wanted to cover all aspects of the person's experience with the system, including industrial design graphics, the interface, the physical interaction, and the manual. Since then, the term has spread widely, so much so that it is starting to lose its meaning." So that was 1998. It's a while back. But user experience has essentially taken on a meaning of its own. It still, I feel, means what Donald Norman meant it to mean, although some people use it to represent very limited parts of the user experience process. So we'll talk more about that. But I want to introduce you to another person who had a big influence and still has a big influence on user experience design. Shortly after Norman gave user experience a name, Alan Cooper published this book, About Face. It's a seminal volume on interaction design. This interface design, essentially. The second edition in 2002 introduced that new term of interaction design, which took hold quite heavily. Cooper picked up a second author, Robert Ryman. 2007 and 2014 saw additional editions of the book where there were more authors and brought in more modern experiences with interface and interaction design. It more or less has followed the trajectory of modern interface design practices and technology advancements. So that's one book that is highly recommended. So the term user experience got another boost by Jesse James Garrett, who incidentally popularized the term AJAX, which is asynchronous JavaScript, if you're familiar with that term at all. But he published a book in 2000 proposing and clarifying a model for user experience design on the web and justifying user experience design as a discipline. So his model of user experience design is worth noting and thinking about. It's a great way to conceptualize the design process and how products are thought of, designed, and then published to the world. On the bottom, this diagram moves from the bottom to the top. On the bottom, you can see it's finding out user needs and set objectives. It's very abstract. It's where you're conceiving of what it is that a user needs in their design or in their lives that would be benefited by an interface or a website. So that's the discovery process. The next comes content requirements and functional specifications. And we'll talk a little bit more about this layer, which I also refer to as defining the product. You move from understanding what user needs are and then make specifications or requirements that this product is meant to meet. You move from there to a more solid representation of those requirements through interaction design and information architecture. That is organizing the information and structuring the site or the application in a way that people can consume it. And it's a less detailed place in the design process than the actual ending interface that people see. Information design is the next level, and that's where you get into the interface and the navigation a little bit more in detail. You begin to solidify the ideas that are held in the information architecture and interaction design. Finally, you move to visual design, which is what I call the high fidelity design layer of this design process. It's what most people see. It's what a lot of people think about when they think, oh, are you a designer? Yes, I'm a designer. Then visual design is what they think of. But for most user experience designers, this whole process falls into the realm of the things that we think about and that we need to consider as we move a product from ideation into completion. Throughout the 80s and the 90s, design of software and digital experiences in general gradually moved from a waterfall process to a more iterative and nimble design approach. What I mean by that is waterfall is you do one step, like if you're looking at this diagram, you do user needs first, then functional specifications, then interaction design, then information design. But what has happened is the cycle has been sped up, so we actually don't try to go through each one and finalize each stage before moving on to the next. We actually go through iterative cycles where we're very quickly coming to a solution for a problem and iterating rather than trying to define an entire product up front. We design pieces, move them through the process, and then move on to the next piece, and then build out an entire product piecemeal through an iterative cycle. The rigidity of the waterfall process was not feasible in the condensed product cycle that we face today in web and mobile application experiences. Designers and researchers began to consult their users of the product in the design process rather than solely at the end to evaluate the product, and then also user research became a formative activity, part of the design process, rather than a summative one merely at the end. So one of the best representations of this is the idea of lean UX. There's a lean movement for a lot of fields. Lean and lean startup was sort of the first that really coined this term. But Jeff GOTHELF and Josh Sladen wrote a book called Lean UX that helps encapsulate the ideas of a lean UX cycle within the context of a lean product development cycle. They published their book in 2013, so a few years ago. And there are numerous debates about what it means to be user experience designers today. There are certainly myriad roles within this discipline, as I mentioned earlier. There are many who call themselves UX designers without understanding a lot of these existing foundations and fundamentals of human-computer experience. It might be easiest to discuss some of these roles and responsibilities in context of the product design cycle. If you search online for the term product design diagrams, you'll have thousands of results, and they're all slightly different. You can see in the backdrop of this slide that there are just a few of the many product design diagrams. There's no one right way to design a product. I want to say that up front and very clearly. There's many, many ways to design a product, and a good product can come from many, many different design cycles or design product systems. But in this graphic that I'm about to show you, we've tried to capture what best represents the idealized product design cycle as it's experienced in the industry. I have about 15 years in the design industry in general, specifically in user experience design, about a decade. And so from all of my experience of all the projects I've worked on, I've tried to distill down as much as possible the cycle in a way that you can talk about it and think about it. The diagram is not literal. It doesn't go step by step in the process. The steps represented are just simple tools and language that we can use to talk about the process. And they're not discrete steps. They overlap and blend. There's one author that talked about design, and he said, the emergent nature of the design process makes design rationale both important and difficult. It is a tool for managing the complexity of a process in which everything, including the problem definition, constantly changes. What we're saying is that we have to have a rationale for our design decisions. And the process that we use to have that rationale, to make those design decisions, is extremely important and extremely hard, because when you're going through the process, you are constantly changing everything. A lot of times the changes aren't huge, but sometimes they are huge and you have to go back to the drawing board. And so what we're talking about today is just how to think about the design process so that you make it easier and understand the things that need to happen in order to reach a solution. So the product design process, I feel, steps through the following steps. First, discovery, then definition, ideation, prototyping, development, and testing. And then we're back to discovery again. So discovery comes in many forms. In our next class, we will focus on explaining and practicing some of these discovery tools. But for today, we'll just touch on it briefly. Discovery is also known as user research and is an important part of a user-centered design paradigm. It takes the form of interviews, it takes the form of observations, surveys, basically any form in which we can get data about an intended user of our product or devices or applications, preferably in a context where they're actually using the product or would be using the product and the software. After a discovery period, we go to a definition period. And the definition phase is where designers analyze findings from the discovery phase. We'll cover this later too, but there are tools that we can use to make sense of all that raw data, the things we've observed, the numbers that we've gathered through our processes. And there are processes that we can use to capture and describe circumstances and the things the users need in order to meet their objectives. Following the definition stage, we have the ideation stage. And this tends to be the fun part of the design process. And sometimes it's mistaken for design itself. Many people think of designers as the idea folks, and that's just one part of the process. Ideation is the expansive, stretching, creative part of the process. It's loose and exciting, and it's exploration and generation. But ideation is insufficient to create a product of value. Ideas have to be beaten down and tested and tried and reformulated, and then finally they're refined and built into something better. Raw ideas are cheap, they're easy to come by, but an idea that works and is useful and people want to pay for, that takes a designer. Prototyping is the next step, and it's the start of the refining process that I just talked about. In the prototyping phase, we put frames around ideas, and we dress up the ideas in various states of dress so that we can put the ideas in front of people, our users, our intended users, and see how they react to them. It's quick and it's rough, and it can form a tight loop and cycle with ideation, one feeding and changing the other. So this is one of the areas where these steps are not discrete. You might move from ideation to prototyping, then back to ideation again, and then maybe even back to discovery and definition in order to move back into prototyping again. Prototyping is meant to give us quick information without expending all the effort to create a full product, to the point that which the problem definition changes. And like I said, it might require you to start back into digging deeper in the discovery process before moving into development. Development, I'm using this term today in a way that we're referring to the final creation of the customer-facing product. That includes both the high fidelity design and the product development, that the coding, the development of the coding language in order to get it in a functional state. At that point of development, we feel like the ideas have been tested and refined in the prototypes at the prototype phase that would allow us to avoid rework and reduce the chances for errors in the development phase, since the development phase tends to be more costly than some of these earlier phases. Our concept of development includes not only the technical development of code, but the creation and documentation of the high fidelity interface mockups that communicate design intent to the development team. And testing, the last one in our diagram, is once a product is live and submitted to users, we test it with them to ensure it meets their expectations and our product expectations. It's sometimes called user acceptance testing. This can be done in a variety of ways, including usability testing and also analytics monitoring, using something like Google Analytics or Adobe's analytics tools. So that's the product design cycle. When we create an interface, I want to think a little bit more, moving into the concepts of what, as a designer, you're thinking about as we create an interface. And what we're doing is we're creating a bucket of decisions that people have to make, a bucket of symbols that they have to comprehend, and then a bucket of actions that they could take or have to take in order to accomplish what they want to accomplish. These three buckets, if they're not thoughtfully created, can become a deluge of information that is overwhelming for people. In academia, we call it cognitive overload, but it essentially amounts to people getting really, really frustrated. They either abandon the product altogether, their objectives, or they suffer through the product because it might be something they have to get done for work. But at any rate, if they have to suffer through a bad product with cognitive overload, then they're cursing your name and your children and your pets all along the way. So cognitive overload is something that you have to think about in those three buckets of decisions and actions and symbols. You have to realize each little step adds up on the other. You have to understand that one confusing form field might not be a big deal. One typo isn't the end of the world. What happens though is that through the process, every extra step, every extra decision, every even slightly confusing element builds stress. It might seem like a small thing, but when it is compounded, all those little things lead to cognitive overload and unhappy customers. You should be concerned about the person using your app or your software or your website. You should care about what they think. Your job is to help them. Obviously, your employer has some say in how much time you're allotted to be able to help people and solve problems. But if you make your focus on creating something people will have no trouble using or even have fun or enjoy using, you will always be able to find someone who will pay you good money to help their customers. Because a problem solved early in the customer process results in less time using the call center to solve problems or address user issues or people on the phone with call center employees. Design makes an impact on the overall business structure without question. So before getting farther into the this course today, I want to talk about some concepts about interface design, and they will be just very, very useful moving forward to you in the future. These concepts that we'll be explaining come from Don Norman's book, The Design of Everyday Things, which I highly recommend you read, and also from the writings of Jacob Nielsen, the Nielsen-Norman Group. He's a usability researcher. I mentioned him earlier. We're reviewing just 3 ideas today to keep it simple, and we'll build all these in the future. These concepts are related to each other, and considering each one of these concepts, every time you work on an interface, will make your products better. And even better, if you implicitly internalize these principles, you'll be able to quickly design without making mistakes that new designers often make because they're not aware of these principles. As I talk about these, I'll be referencing at the beginning the design of physical objects. If you don't immediately see the relevance to software design, just bear with me because we'll be talking about in a minute. So first, the principle of affordance. Affordance means there are physical attributes, visible qualities to an object that suggest how they should be used. When you design something that has a purpose, your objective should be to give that object as much affordance as possible to help people. In the physical world, affordance manifests itself as pull handles, buttons, and dials. It is extremely frustrating to reach for a pull handle on a door only to realize then that you can't pull the door, you have to push it open. In many cases, once a door like that has been installed, then the custodians have to also install a push sign later, usually one you only see once you've already tried to pull, and it can often be very embarrassing. The second principle is recognition is better than recall. Recognizing the affordance is much easier than trying to remember that this is a push door. Installing a push plate can help you recognize a push door when you see one, and creating a design that is that has an obvious purpose is so much better than trying to remember what something does. One way to aid recognition in an ambiguous context is by adding a label. Reading the sign or a label is often better than not having a sign, even if it's less aesthetically attractive. So in the previous screen, we saw a label on a door. Affordance would be better, some physical manifestation that signals what you should do, but a label is better than nothing. So in digital design, there's an example of icons at the bottom of this mobile app example. On the left, the airplane, the check mark, the star, and the human head, those all have ambiguous meanings. Star could be like, it could be rate, or the check mark could be I'm done here, or it could be go to a list. The airplane could be anything having to do with airplanes, and the person is usually an account figure, but it could be friends, something like that. So you put a label on, it removes the ambiguity, and it's one less thing that people have to think about when they're doing this using this application. So in the case of the plane, change it to my trips book for check mark, club for the star, and the count for the head. So I want to remind you here about the concept of buckets of decisions and actions and symbols that I mentioned previously. We can sometimes expect our users to learn something in order to use our products. And in some cases, like something extremely complex like Photoshop or Adobe Illustrator, people will just have to learn some things because there's too much to have all out at once. It's not forbidden. But this is where we must be aware of all those micro moments of annoyance. If you are not conscientious about how you do that as a designer, then all of these decisions can build up into a sea of frustration. If you have buttons that look like text boxes or icons that have ambiguous meanings, people have to start clicking and tapping around until they find what they're looking for. Their decision-making capacity gets filled very quickly and they drop your app like it's hot. So looking for ways to introduce affordance and recognition into your product will improve your product immediately and immensely. A bunch of little micro wins will lead to a big win in the end. So let's talk about the third concept, which is natural mapping. Natural mapping is related to these other concepts in that it helps provide an affordance or aids recognition for what a user is supposed to do. Natural mapping refers to placement of controls relative to the thing being controlled. The best example in the physical world that I've seen is an oven range. Ranges generally have knobs for the 4 or 5 burners on the stove. And sometimes those knobs are placed in a single horizontal row like this image here, or they're above or below the burners. Sometimes they're not even on the same plane, they're on a separate panel. And you're left to guess which knob aligns with which stovetop. Adding labels, as you can see on the very bottom of the image, there are labels next to the knobs on the bottom right, which show which burner they're associated to. But that takes a lot of extra cognitive power. Natural mapping takes the idea of labels a step further and places the knobs next to the relevant burner. So in this example, you can see just by the shape of where the knobs are, which knob is associated with which burner. And so without having to think about it, you reach for the upper right knob for the upper right burner, upper left knob for the upper left burner, and so forth. The problem is sometimes that a product designer will desire an aesthetic placement of controls, a straight line of the knobs together, or perhaps the engineer wants to keep all of the wires next to each other or in a certain order, the components together to simplify a manufacturing process. But the user experience designer is saying, is that trade-off worth it? Do we gain enough in efficiency to warrant giving people a more confusing experience? There's a lot of evidence to argue that the easier you make something to use, the more people will want to use it. But you also run the risk of if your design makes something a lot more expensive in order to spend the time to design it or build it that way, then you may run into an impediment of people not feeling it's worth it to pay the extra cost for the better experience. With every product, you have to weigh the pros and cons. But what I'd like to help you understand today is that you need to save you from yourself. With a little user testing, important design changes can be made early enough in the process that you can create a better experience without having to have as many trade-offs in efficiency or building later on. So, how do these design concepts manifest themselves in a digital environment? First, affordance. Buttons and links are a big place where affordance makes a big difference. If you don't give your text link a treatment that is understandable, people won't know where to click or to click on a link, and you lose out on that option for interaction. Likewise, buttons can often be mistaken for non-interactive elements if appropriate affordance is not applied. There's an obvious spectrum of affordance, from a plain white box to a colored box, to curved corner boxes, to round and pill-shaped buttons, to buttons with a drop shadow or other 3D attributes that hints at pressability or clickability. all the way up to what's known as skeuomorphism, where the digital components are designed to look like physical artifacts. And that's what the early iOS, first iPhone, a lot of its components and controls were very skeuomorphic. That is, there was a notes app that looked like a pad of paper and a calendar that looked like a physical calendar. And design has steered away from that in the digital realm because the skeuomorphism adds a lot of weight to a design that doesn't actually add the affordance that it was hoping to provide. You can see in that paragraph on the left, the blue underlined link has a lot of affordance according to current modern paradigms of the web. You know that a blue underlined link is a link and you click on it. Some people will design things like, the second paragraph where there's a bold or bold italicized and hoping people will hover over it and see a hand and then click on it. But depending on your audience, those would most likely be not a very good solution for your product. So you have to consider and then ideally test and see how people do in using that. But generally speaking, the more affordance, the better your product will be. As I mentioned, icons on buttons are a big place where recognition over recall comes into play. If you use an icon that has been created specifically for the Android environment in a web app that's accessed by all mobile platforms, you lose the recognition power of that icon for half your users. Adding a label goes a long way to helping people recognize what a button is supposed to do. Natural mapping is not as frequently needed into interface design, but being aware can help you in situations where you need an easier solution for people. An obvious place would be to place left and right arrows at the left and right edges of a screen indicating what that control might do, a carousel, for example, rather than creating a centralized control. These are very simple implementations, and discussion of these principles, and the reason I bring them up now is that even when you've studied and worked hard to understand usability principles and cognitive design principles, and you can create an interface, you still bungle things up from time to time. Each case, each design is unique. Each product's user base has different qualities and backgrounds that it's hard to know without interacting with them. For you, an icon might seem super obvious, and it could mean only one thing to everybody. But in testing, you might quickly realize and discern that for your particular audience, that symbol actually has no meaning. And really, there's only one way to find out many times is to talk to your users. For developers and designers, there's also a big danger of knowing too much about the system. Understanding the database schema, the algorithms, the markup of any of these under the hood elements, it can blind you to a simpler user experience. You might say, okay, this is an idea of what you might see in your mind about the way the system fits together. And you say, okay, we need to collect a name, an email, phone number, password, and an image to build out the user profile. That's what you need. The simplest way to do that is to create a form at the beginning of the experience with all the relevant fields and ask the user to complete it. But in testing, the user says, I don't want to give you all my information until I know I really want to buy into the product a little more. I'll give you my throwaway email and a password, but not my number or name or image. Let me look around and see if I like it, then I'll give you more. The user interface initially becomes a lot simpler, but the underlying code base can become more complex as you have to create opportunities to collect that additional information in the future. And so by making this initial step simpler, you're making the product itself underneath the hood a little bit more complex. Sometimes you'll get pushback from stakeholders, including the development team, just saying, hey, we can't do all this extra work, but it's the role of the user experience designer to help make an argument and make it clear to people that by creating a better product, you actually get more people to use it, and then we can pay the developers for all the time that they need to do to take and make a more complex system. So we've covered a lot of ground today, and I really only glanced off the surface of the history and the context of user experience design. There's a lot there. We've discussed some names like Donald Norman, Jesse James Garrett, Jacob Nielsen, Steve Krug, and we've presented the concept of product design cycle. We've discussed each phase in the cycle. And then we've presented a few design concepts: affordance, natural mapping, and cognitive overload, and recognition over recall. Now I have two primary tasks for you to complete during the next hour that then you can talk about in the following hour. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about these assignments. But first, tomorrow we're going to be talking about user research. And for the assignment, I want you to be able to practice doing a user interview for a discovery phase. And so I want you to talk to someone, ideally who you're comfortable with. So I want you to, if you possibly can, to find someone to interview and have them available for you to give them a call or to come over to your house, your apartment, or whatever at right after the class gets over tomorrow. So make sure that they can meet with you or let you call them at about 6 o'clock Pacific time, 7 o'clock Mountain, 8 o'clock Central, 9 o'clock Eastern. We may be able to figure out a way to do that if you can't find someone, but I really want you to try to find someone that you are comfortable with. And the thing that we'll be interviewing them about is a shopping experience. And it can be a grocery shopping or clothes shopping, whatever. You don't need to necessarily tell them that, but just find someone that might have gone shopping within the last couple of weeks. That'll be very helpful. Okay, for the second assignment, I want you to see if you can recognize designers' application of the principles of these principles in your daily experience. So the assignment you should tackle over the next hour is to evaluate as many experiences as you can, websites, mobile apps, or web applications within the next hour and make notes on them. We want to know, who do you think is the intended audience? What outcomes were the experienced designers designing for them to achieve? How successful were the designs at achieving those objectives? And then point out the design decisions that affect the overall experience. So I'm going to open up, the assignment folder, and we'll go through that a little bit more in detail. And I'll share this link with you as well, so you can read over it. Just posting that in the Slack channel. All right, so the assignment, as I talked about, is evaluate as many digital experiences as you can. They can be websites, mobile apps, or web apps. And you can choose from apps or sites that you use every day, or check out some new ones. I've put a few in the list at the very bottom of this page that you could start with if you don't know exactly where to start yourself. But for each experience, you're going to go through to capture screenshots and take notes on what you find and answer the following questions. Who do you think the intended audience is? What outcomes or objectives were they designed to achieve? How successful were those designs at achieving those objectives? Point out design decisions that affect the overall experience. What affordances were made for actions to make them more easily recognized? In what ways did designers help them recognize actions to take rather than have to recall them? And in what ways did they use natural mapping in their designs? I'd like you to take screenshots. With an iPhone or iPad, you can press the power and home button at the exact same time. The Mac Command-Shift-3 will give you a full screenshot, or you can do Command-Shift-4 and click and drag, and I'll show you that in a minute. For Android, press power and volume down at the exact same time, and it'll take a screenshot. And I'll show you, I want you to annotate each of the screenshots in Preview, save in any annotated files, and then create a Google Doc called Assignment 1 with a hyphen and then your name. That will help us find it. And then share that doc with me, Christian at lambdaschool.com. And then place the annotated screenshots inside the Google Doc, add any additional notes to explain the annotations, and then send a Slack message to me when your assignment is finished. And then each experience should be added to the Google Doc to look basically like this. See if we can bump up a little bit. So for example, the experience, you'd link to the website, or if it's an app, a link to its place in the App Store, or just the name of the experience here if you can't find a link. Then you name the audience. Is it all Mac owners, age 12 to 45, male? People who need to get something done and are looking for an app to solve a problem, or screenshots. So the screenshot can be done with whatever screenshot tool you use. And then to do annotations, this is how I do it. So I'm going to do Command Shift 4, do a screenshot. It shows up here on my desktop. Oops. And in Preview, which is the Mac automatic application for opening JPEG files or PNG files, you have a toolbar up here with tools to create shapes. And so you create a shape and circle it something with a rectangle or a circle like I've done here. And then you put a number next to it by using the text tool. Type the number, you can drag it over. So this is an example that I already did. I did a rectangle here, put the number 2, the circle here, number 1. And then in the Google Doc, I just wrote annotation 1. Arrow appears on hover and is a decent example of affordance. And annotation 2, down arrow is a common symbol of a drop-down menu, so it's a good example of affordance and natural mapping. So basically, I want you to take the time to just dig into as many applications as you have. Some might be really simple, like the App Store I did here. There's just a few controls and a few images, and it's basically all the same after that. Excuse me. So once you do a couple of annotations, then you could move on to the next application. If you open something like Adobe Illustrator, you might be there the whole hour just looking for different signals and design intent. So that is the assignment for today. I am going to open up chat and see if there's some questions I can help answer. So what's going to happen now is at the conclusion of my presentation here, then you'll be able to just start out on your own, go to the Slack channel for questions, see if there's anything that we can help you with there. And then once that next hour is coming to a close, you'll receive a link there in the Slack channel. And we come back into a Zoom meeting, and then we'll break up into smaller groups for a group discussion and be able to talk about these things. And what I want you to do is I'm going to try to move your assignments as they come in over to an accessible folder so that you can open them up as groups and be able to talk about some of the things that you found, share with each other, and be able to see whether you're all on the same page, feeling like things are the same or not, and your understanding of what we talked about. And then I wanted to mention that there's a link, the attendance form as well, that's been posted in the Zoom webinar chat field. And that really helps us to be able to know how many people are attending these free courses and what they're gaining from them, and sort of helps us steer them to make them the most beneficial that they can be for our potential users. So Boomer has put a link in there to the form. If you can fill that out, that would be really super helpful. And if anyone has any other questions for me, feel free to put them in the webinar chat or Slack quickly, and then in a couple of minutes I'll wrap up. So I got a question. Can you just say the definition of affordance again? Sure, Leanne. Affordance is basically the concept that there are physical, visible attributes of whatever control that you're making that hints at what that control can be used for. So in the physical world, I mentioned a pull handle has physical attributes that make you want to pull it. A push plate has physical attributes that makes you feel like, oh, I should push that to open that door. A button on a digital web interface, if it has a slight drop shadow on it, will often feel like a button that somebody should click, as opposed to just a line around a box that is filled with text. The underline in a text link represents an affordance that this is a clickable link. And that's because of the culture of the web at this point, as opposed to specifically feeling like you could click it. But it is much the same. Does that answer your question? And then Janine asked, which part of the UX is the simplifying the entry to a product? Which part of UX is the simplifying the entry to a product, email, password, and then adding it on later? So that is trying to reduce cognitive overload, and it's something that I use as an example to represent something you might find out during user research. I don't know that I would give that particular thing a name, but there's something known as Occam's razor that might apply here, where you're trying to remove everything that is not absolutely essential. That is something that is a very good user experience design practice. Does that answer that question? All right, great. Cool. So it's been great to be able to share with you a few things tonight. I hope you guys go through and really give that exercise some thought, because what I'm really hoping that you'll do is get the wheels spinning about what does it mean to be user experience designer? What are designers thinking about when they're creating an application or interface, as opposed to just thinking, does this color look pretty? You think about ways to help the user achieve their objectives. And so these principles we talked about today are just a little foundational layer to get your wheels turning. And we'll talk more about other principles. Next Monday, there's going to be a deeper dive onto a few more things that will help that process. But thanks again today. And I'm going to close out this Zoom for now and look for another message from Boomer to jump back into the group sessions later on. And thanks, everybody. It's been great to be with you today.